The Bible had been sitting on the top shelf of St. Bartholomew's dusty library for as long as anyone could remember. Bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of candle soot, it was the sort of relic parishioners passed by without a second glance. But to Thomas Alden, the quiet, bespectacled librarian who had tended the church's books for nearly 2 decades, every volume was a story waiting to be heard. That afternoon, as the pale winter light slanted through the stained glass windows, he lifted the tome down with the same reverence he reserved for rare manuscripts. Thomas's days were filled with silence, broken only by the creak of old wood and the faint ticking of the brass clock above the doorway. His life was measured in catalogue cards and the soft rustle of pages. No one suspected that beneath his calm, measured demeanour lay a mind trained in patterns, the same mind that, years ago, had once cracked a sequence of medieval Latin texts for a visiting scholar. He never spoke of that moment. He didn't need to. When he opened the Bible, something caught his eye almost immediately. Faint, deliberate marks scattered through the margins. A dot here. Across there, tiny ink smudges that didn't match the rest of the handwriting. They were too systematic to be random blemishes. He ran his fingers lightly over the page, feeling the faint indentation of each mark, as if the scribe had pressed with purpose. A murmur of curiosity stirred in him. He turned page after page, realizing the marks followed a strange rhythm, almost like a musician's score. Could it be a code? The thought lodged itself firmly in his mind, and once it took root, Thomas knew there would be no rest until he had unravelled it. For hours he bent over the desk, comparing the positions of the marks, cross-referencing them with passages. His tea went cold, the fading light dimmed, yet he worked on, oblivious to the frost forming on the library's leaded windows. As he traced the sequence through the Old and New Testaments, a strange alignment emerged. Certain marked verses, when taken together, hinted at a journey, a place. By the time the church bell tolled 6, Thomas leaned back, rubbing his temples. He felt both exhilarated and unsettled. This was no ordinary marginalia. It was intentional, designed to be hidden in plain sight. And the more he looked, the more he was convinced that someone, centuries ago, had embedded a secret within Holy Scripture. That evening, as the last parishioner shuffled out and Father Gregory locked the front doors, Thomas remained behind. He stared at the Bible, still open to the first page where the marks began, his pulse quickening. A thought whispered at the edge of his mind, a memory from his youth when his grandfather had spoken in hushed tones about the guardians of the greatest treasure never found. Back then, Thomas had dismissed it as folklore, the sort of fireside tale meant to enthrall a boy. But now, as the shadows lengthened, the words returned with unnerving clarity. Could it be? The door to the library creaked open. Father Gregory stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Still working, Thomas?" he asked, his gaze drifting to the ancient Bible. Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I think there's something in here," he said quietly. "Something no one's noticed before." The priest's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in something closer to recognition. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "There are old stories about that book," he said. "Stories most would rather forget." Thomas leaned forward. "What kind of stories?" Father Gregory glanced toward the darkened windows as if ensuring no one could overhear. "Legends, Thomas. That the Knights Templar themselves placed their secrets into the hands of men who would guard them, and that some of those secrets were hidden in Bibles like this." Thomas's breath caught. The name alone carried weight. The Templars, those warrior monks whose fate had been shrouded in mystery since their fall 7 centuries ago. And now, this priest was suggesting their trail might begin in his very hands. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Father Gregory's life. The candle beside them flickered as if stirred by an unseen breath. In that moment, Thomas understood 2 things. First, that his quiet life was about to change forever, and second, that some secrets once uncovered can never be put back into the dark. The following morning, the church lay wrapped in a hushed stillness, the kind that seemed older than the stones themselves. Thomas arrived early, long before the first shafts of light pierced the stained glass, carrying the Bible under his arm as though it were something alive. He had hardly slept. Father Gregory's whispered words had replayed in his mind all night, each repetition fanning the flame of a question he could not extinguish. Could the legends be true? Father Gregory was already in his study, a mug of black coffee steaming beside an open ledger. He looked up as Thomas entered, his eyes shadowed with something more than lack of sleep. "You've brought it," he said, not a question, but a statement. Thomas set the Bible down on the desk and opened it to the marked pages. "You said there were stories," he began. "I need to hear them, all of them." The priest leaned back, fingers steepled. "The tale has been passed in whispers for generations. During the height of their power, the Knights Templar were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and worse. But not all of them fell. Some fled, taking with them treasures far greater than gold, documents, relics, knowledge itself. It's said that to keep these out of the hands of their enemies, they created a chain of guardians, men of faith, men of learning, scattered across Europe, each entrusted with a fragment of the whole, and in rare cases—" His gaze flicked to the Bible. "Their clues were hidden in sacred texts." Thomas listened, torn between skepticism and the pull of the mystery. "You believe this book is one of those cases?" "I believe," Father Gregory said slowly, "that someone went to great lengths to ensure only a certain kind of mind could find what was hidden here. You may be that mind, Thomas." The words stirred something deep in him. Not pride exactly, but a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He traced the margin marks again, feeling the faint grooves beneath his fingertips. "If this is a cipher," he murmured, "then it must have a key, and keys are always hidden in plain sight." They worked in silence for the next hour, Father Gregory cross-referencing church records, while Thomas tested combinations of letters and numbers. The markings seemed to correspond to specific verses, but the order was nonsensical. It wasn't until Thomas remembered an old monastic cipher, one that substituted letters for the positions of certain psalms, that the first fragments of meaning emerged. 2 words, via sancta, the holy way. He looked up sharply. "Father, this is a map." The priest's brows drew together. "A map to where?" "That," Thomas said, "is the question." Before either man could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor outside. Slow, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Father Gregory's expression tightened. He rose, crossed to the door, and peered into the hall. No one was there. When he returned, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. "We may not be the only ones who know of this book." The words sank into Thomas's mind like stones into deep water. He thought of the musty stacks, the quiet isolation he had always cherished, now feeling suddenly porous, exposed. The cipher was no longer just a curiosity, it was dangerous. Still, the hunger for answers outweighed the fear. Thomas bent back over the pages, and with each verse decoded, a pattern took shape. Coordinates, angles, references to saints and feast days. The fragments began to point toward a specific place, one neither of them had expected. A monastery, abandoned for centuries, standing alone on the edge of the coastal cliffs. Father Gregory exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on the final translated line. "If this is right," he said, "then the road to the Templar's greatest secret has just opened, and we are standing at its threshold." The church bells began to toll for morning mass, their sound reverberating through the stone walls. Outside, the sun finally crept through the stained glass, casting blood-red light across the pages of the Bible. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down on him, and the faint, undeniable sense that they were already being watched. The coastal wind howled through the cracked panes of Thomas's small flat that night, rattling them like impatient fingers. He sat hunched over his desk, the ciphered Bible open beside a faded map of the country's western shore. The coordinates he and Father Gregory had uncovered pointed unerringly to a crumbling mark on the map, St. Corentin's monastery. He traced the spot with a fingertip, imagining the salt spray, the desolate cliffs, and the long-forgotten stones standing against centuries of storms. St. Corentin's had been abandoned since the late 1700s, its last monks driven out during political upheaval. Rumour had it the monastery had been built atop an older, more ancient foundation, one whose origins predated Christianity in the region. That fact alone set Thomas's pulse racing. If the Templars had chosen such a place to hide something, they had chosen well. But the practicalities loomed large. The site was remote, the road to it little more than a narrow track through marsh and heathland. Winter storms could cut off access for days, and there was the matter of being discreet. He had no illusions, and if anyone else suspected the truth, they might already be making plans to reach it first. The next morning, Thomas met Father Gregory in the vestry, the smell of incense still lingering from the early Mass. He slid the map across the table. "It's here," he said simply. Gregory studied it, his expression unreadable. "You know, don't you, that this will not be without danger?" "I know," Thomas said, though the words felt heavier than he'd expected. The priest leaned closer. "We go quietly, we tell no one, and we leave no trail that could lead others there." They agreed to travel separately, meeting in the small fishing village closest to the monastery's cliffs. Thomas would take the train under the guise of visiting an old university friend. Gregory, an unassuming parish car. It would take them 2 days to converge. That night, Thomas packed with deliberate care. A change of clothes, sturdy boots, his worn leather satchel containing notebooks, pencils, and a magnifying glass, and the Bible, wrapped in cloth, as if to shield it from both prying eyes and the sea air. The journey began in grey dawn light. The train rocked gently, its rhythmic clatter over the rails a counterpoint to the thoughts crowding Thomas's mind. He found himself replaying the discovery over and over. The marks in the Bible, the priest's whispered legend, the way the coordinates had emerged like something inevitable. Part of him still couldn't believe he was doing this, stepping out of his quiet life into a pursuit that felt more suited to an adventurer than a church librarian. At the second change of trains, he noticed a man in a dark coat lingering on the opposite platform. He was reading a newspaper, yet somehow his head turned each time Thomas moved. The man boarded a separate carriage, but when Thomas glanced out at the next stop, there he was again, alighting a few paces behind. A prickle of unease climbed Thomas's spine. He told himself it was coincidence, but the rhythm of the man's presence was too precise. Someone was watching him. By the time Thomas arrived at the village, dusk was falling. The air was damp, carrying the briny tang of the sea. He spotted Father Gregory waiting near the harbour, hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. "You weren't followed?" Gregory asked at once. Thomas hesitated, then gave a small shake of his head. "Not that I could prove." The priest's gaze sharpened. "We move at first light. If someone else knows, we need to reach the monastery before they do." They walked together through the narrow lanes to a small inn, their footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, waves pounded against the cliffs, a steady, relentless beat. Thomas felt the pull of that sound deep in his bones, as if the sea itself were calling him to finish what he had begun. In the flickering candlelight of his rented room, he laid the Bible on the table once more. The coded marks seemed almost to shimmer under the flame, as if aware that their secret was one step closer to being revealed. Tomorrow they would walk into the heart of the legend, and possibly into the shadow of whoever had been trailing them. Morning came shrouded in a cold mist that clung to the harbour and blurred the line between sea and sky. Thomas and Father Gregory moved quietly through the half-asleep village, their boots crunching on gravel as they followed the narrow coastal path. The air smelled of salt and wet stone. Somewhere far below, the waves hissed against the cliff base, muffled by the fog. Thomas had the Bible tucked safely inside his satchel, the weight of it oddly comforting against his side. Every so often he glanced back along the path, scanning for movement. Twice he thought he saw a shadow detach itself from the rocks, but each time it vanished into the shifting white. They walked for nearly an hour before the monastery appeared, or rather loomed, out of the fog. St. Corentin's stood like a dark skeleton against the pale mist, its crumbling walls and roofless nave open to the sky. Seabirds wheeled above the broken spire, their cries sharp and unsettling. The main gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, groaning as Gregory pushed it open. Inside, the courtyard was carpeted with moss, broken flagstones jutting like old teeth. Thomas's eyes darted from one shadowed archway to another. "We'll start in the chapel," Gregory murmured. The chapel was little more than 4 standing walls and the remains of an altar. The air inside was colder, heavier, as if it had not been stirred for centuries. Thomas set the satchel on a stone ledge, drawing out the Bible. He opened it to the page marked by the most intricate cluster of dots and crosses. The coordinates and Latin phrases they had deciphered the night before matched the chapel's layout with eerie precision. Thomas counted his steps from the door to the altar, then traced his fingers along the base of the stone structure. That was when he felt it. A slight irregularity, a groove where there should have been smooth rock. Gregory knelt beside him. "A mechanism?" Thomas nodded. The groove concealed a small iron ring, so rusted it blended with the stone. He gripped it, pulled, and with a deep, grinding protest, a section of the altar shifted. A square of darkness yawned open beneath their feet. Before they could descend, a sound froze them in place, the crunch of footsteps on gravel outside the chapel, slow, deliberate. Thomas's gaze darted to the doorway. A silhouette appeared in the fog, broad-shouldered, unmoving. Another figure joined it, then another, 3 in total, blocking the only exit. Gregory's hand went instinctively to the cross around his neck. "They've found us," he whispered. Thomas's mind raced. Whoever these men were, they had been tracking them since the village, perhaps even before. The trapdoor gaped at his feet, promising both escape and uncertainty. The alternative was to confront the strangers here in the cold, hollowed heart of the monastery. The lead figure stepped forward, his voice low, but carrying, That book belongs to us." Thomas's fingers tightened on the Bible. "It belongs to history," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his tone. The man's smile was thin. "History is written by those who hold the pen, and right now, we hold the way out." The implication was clear. They were cornered. The only unguarded direction was down, into whatever waited beneath the altar. Gregory met Thomas's eyes, a silent question passing between them. Then, without another word, they swung the trap door fully open. A damp, ancient smell rose up, thick with earth and something metallic. Thomas slung the satchel across his chest and stepped onto the narrow stone steps, descending into darkness. Gregory followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. The last thing Thomas saw before it shut was the lead stranger's face, a pale, cold mask that promised this was far from over. The steps spiraled steeply, the air growing colder with each turn. Somewhere deep below, a faint trickle of water echoed in the dark. Thomas's hand brushed the wall. It was damp, etched with faint symbols that looked almost like the markings in the Bible. The realization sent a shiver through him. If the Templars had truly hidden something here, they had guarded it with more than stone and secrecy. They had woven it into the very bones of this place. The spiral stairs ended abruptly in a low, arched chamber. The ceiling so close that Thomas had to stoop. The air was thick, tasting faintly of iron and salt. A single shaft of light filtered down through a crack in the stone above, casting a pale beam across the floor. They were standing in what appeared to be a crypt. Narrow alcoves carved into the walls, each holding the remnants of stone coffins. The lids bore worn carvings of crosses, swords, and a curious 8-pointed star that Thomas recognized from the margins of the Bible. The Templar seal. Gregory's breath was visible in the frigid air. "We're standing beneath the altar," he murmured. "This must have been a private burial place for high-ranking brothers." Thomas stepped into the beam of light, his eyes drawn to a darker patch in the far wall. It was an archway, half sealed by a slab of stone. Etched into it were the same dots and crosses from the cipher, now arranged in a pattern he could almost read. He ran his fingers over the carvings. "It's the key," he said. "These symbols match the final sequence in the Bible." Gregory crouched beside him, tracing the pattern in the air. "If the order of marks in the book is applied here." They worked together, pressing certain stones in sequence. With each correct press, a dull, resonant click echoed in the small chamber. When Thomas pushed the final one, the slab shuddered and began to pivot inward with the slow inevitability of centuries-old mechanisms. Beyond was a narrow passage, the air colder still, carrying a faint metallic tang. They stepped through, their footfalls muffled on the damp stone. The passage widened into a circular chamber. And there, in the flickering beam of Thomas's flashlight, lay a sight that stopped them both in their tracks. A row of ornate wooden chests, bound with iron straps and stamped with the Templar cross, rested against the far wall. Between them stood a heavy table littered with scroll tubes, gilded reliquaries, and a single sword whose blade caught the light like water. "This," Gregory whispered, his voice thick, "is the vault." Thomas approached one of the chests, the wood dark with age. The lock was a complex mechanism, but when he touched it, the metal was cool and free of rust, as if it had been maintained. Someone had been here more recently than history allowed. Before they could examine further, a sound drifted faintly down the stairs behind them, the echo of boots on stone. Thomas's stomach clenched. The men from the chapel had found the trapdoor. Gregory's eyes met his, urgent. "We don't have time. Take what you can carry." Thomas hesitated. Every instinct screamed to protect the vault, not plunder it. But if these strangers reached it first, centuries of history could vanish into private hands forever. He reached for the nearest scroll tube, its seal unbroken, and slipped it into his satchel. Then, with a deep breath, he grasped the sword. Its weight was perfectly balanced, the leather-wrapped hilt fitting into his palm as though it had been made for him. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the muted murmur of voices. There was no other visible exit from the chamber. Gregory scanned the walls, his fingers brushing over the carvings. "Help me look! There has to be another way out." Thomas's flashlight beam swept across the far side of the room and caught the faint outline of another arch, half buried behind a stack of crates. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. They shoved the crates aside just as the first shadow darkened the entrance to the chamber. The beam of another flashlight swept across the vault, momentarily blinding Thomas. A voice barked, "Stop where you are!" Thomas ducked into the narrow opening, Gregory right behind him. The passage beyond sloped sharply downward, the damp air rushing past them like the breath of something ancient. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew sharper, echoing through the stone like the heartbeat of the hunt. Somewhere ahead, the darkness deepened, and Thomas had the uncanny sense that they were descending into a place the intruders might fear to follow. The narrow passage twisted like the inside of a shell, the air growing colder and the stone slick beneath their hands. The sound of pursuit faded for a moment, swallowed by the dense silence ahead. Thomas's breath came in sharp bursts, each exhale hanging briefly in the air before vanishing into the dark. The slope leveled out abruptly, spilling them into a vast subterranean hall. The ceiling soared far above, supported by thick columns carved with the same 8-pointed star and Latin inscriptions that danced just beyond the reach of Thomas's memory. The air was heavy with age, but there was no scent of decay, only the faint tang of metal and oil. Then he saw it. At the far end of the hall stood a raised stone platform, and upon it a single chest unlike the others. Smaller, but made entirely of blackened iron, its surface etched with intricate patterns that shimmered faintly in the beam of Thomas's flashlight. Flanking it were 2 marble statues of armored knights. Their swords pointed toward the floor, their stone eyes fixed in eternal watch. Gregory approached slowly, reverently. "This is older than the vault above," he whispered. "Older than the monastery itself. This may be what the Templars built everything else to protect." Thomas knelt before the chest. Its lock was unlike any he'd seen, 3 separate keyholes, each surrounded by a ring of inscribed symbols. He reached into his satchel, pulling out the ciphered Bible, and flipped to the page where the markings first began. They weren't just coordinates, he realized now. They were instructions. "Father," he said, "I think the book itself is the key." Gregory helped him position the Bible on the platform. Each cluster of marks corresponded to a symbol around one of the keyholes. By pressing the correct sequence of symbols, they heard a muted click, then another, then a third. The chest gave a faint sigh, as if exhaling after centuries of silence. Inside, instead of gold or jewels, lay a bundle of carefully wrapped parchment and a single object, a golden cross, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, its center inlaid with a crimson stone. The craftsmanship was so precise it seemed almost alive in the dim light. Gregory lifted the cross with a trembling hand. This is the cross of lamentation. It was believed lost during the fall of Acre in 1291. Legends say it contains a relic from the crucifixion itself. Thomas's eyes shifted to the parchments. Carefully, he unrolled the first. A confession, written in a hand, both elegant and urgent. As he read, the words sent a chill through him. The letter claimed that the Templars had been tasked not with hoarding treasure, but with protecting a truth so dangerous it could shatter the Church's authority. Before he could read further, the sound of boots echoed again, this time from the far end of the hall. The pursuers had found their way down. A beam of light sliced through the shadows, illuminating the statues. Gregory's voice was sharp. "We can't let them take this." Thomas stuffed the parchments into his satchel, handing the cross to Gregory. "Go! There must be another exit." They ran along the outer wall of the hall, ducking behind columns, the intruders' shouts growing louder. One of the men's voices rang out, almost triumphant. "They've got it! Stop them!" A narrow archway appeared ahead, half hidden by a fallen column. Thomas ducked through, Gregory close behind. The passage beyond was rough-hewn and steep, the floor slick with centuries of condensation. Behind them the sound of pursuit became muffled. Perhaps the men feared this deeper, older part of the underground. They climbed for what felt like an eternity until the air began to change. Fresher now, tinged with the unmistakable scent of the sea. A faint light glimmered ahead when they emerged. It was on to a narrow ledge halfway down the cliff face, waves crashing violently below. The opening was invisible from above, concealed by the jagged rock. Gregory looked out at the sea, clutching the cross to his chest. "We've escaped," he said, "but the hardest choice is still ahead." Thomas knew what he meant. They had found the vault, and with it a secret that could shake the world, but to protect it might mean never revealing it at all. The wind tore at their coats as they stood on the narrow cliff ledge, the roar of the surf below drowning out every other sound. The opening they had emerged from was little more than a jagged wound in the rock, invisible from the shore or the cliff top, a perfect hiding place. Thomas steadied himself against the wall, the satchel heavy against his side. Inside, the parchments seemed to burn with significance, as though aware of the weight they carried. Gregory's hands were white-knuckled around the golden cross, his eyes locked on the restless sea. "We can't go back the way we came," Gregory said finally. "They'll be watching the monastery, and if they've seen the passage, they'll know the vault is real." Thomas nodded, scanning the coastline. A narrow, treacherous path seemed to wind upward toward the cliff top, half collapsed in places. It was their only way out. They began to climb, the rock slick with sea spray. More than once, Thomas's boot slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the void below. Gregory's breathing grew labored, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than fear. A fierce, almost protective determination. At the top, they emerged onto wind-swept heathland, the monastery now just a distant silhouette swallowed in fog. Thomas turned back once, a strange mix of triumph and dread tightening his chest. They had found the vault. They had taken its secrets, but in doing so, they had invited a storm. By nightfall, they were holed up in a fisherman's cottage owned by one of Gregory's old acquaintances. The man asked no questions, simply offered them a fire and a pot of stew. Thomas sat by the flames, unrolling one of the parchments. The script was Latin, precise but hurried. Gregory leaned over his shoulder, reading aloud in a low voice. "Yet that the Holy Church shall never bear the burden of this truth, for it would unmake the faith of many." They exchanged a long look. Whatever the Templars had hidden, it was more than a relic. It was knowledge. Dangerous knowledge. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and deliberate. Thomas's hand froze halfway to the scroll. Gregory motioned for silence. The knock came again, followed by a voice neither of them recognized. "We know you have it. You can't keep it hidden forever." Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He rose quietly, motioning toward the back door. Gregory tucked the cross beneath his coat, and together they slipped out into the night. The moon was veiled behind clouds, the village lanes a maze of shadow and silence. They didn't stop until they reached the small harbour. A single boat bobbed against the pier, its owner asleep under a tarpaulin. Gregory woke him with a hand on the shoulder and a whispered offer. Minutes later they were gliding away from the shore, the village lights shrinking to pinpricks behind them. Out on the open water, Thomas finally spoke. "If we keep these, we become the very thing we're trying to protect them from." Gregory stared out at the horizon. "And if we destroy them, we erase history." It was the impossible choice the Templars themselves must have faced centuries ago. To guard the truth at all costs or let it change the world, consequences be damned. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and something faintly metallic. Thomas realized it was coming from the parchments themselves, as if the ink still held the breath of the vault. He tightened his grip on the satchel. "Then we do as they did," he said quietly. "We hide it again, somewhere no one will think to look." Gregory's gaze turned to him, measuring. Then he nodded once. "And we take the secret with us to the grave." In the darkness ahead, the sea stretched infinite and unknowable, a perfect mirror of the path they had just chosen. 3 months later, spring had softened the coastline, but the winds still carried the bite of the open sea. In a quiet village far from St. Corentin's, Thomas sat in the back room of a small parish library, sorting through donations of hymnals and prayer books. His hands moved automatically, but his mind wandered often to that night on the boat, and the decision they had made. The parchments were gone, the golden cross hidden. He and Father Gregory had travelled separately to deposit their burdens in places chosen for obscurity rather than safety. One deep within the vaults of a monastery in the mountains, the other in a sealed crate among hundreds in a disused maritime archive. No records linked them to the deposits, no names, no clues, only memory. Gregory visited once, arriving in an unmarked car and staying just long enough to share a quiet meal. They spoke of ordinary things, parish repairs, a mutual acquaintance's failing health. But beneath their words lay the unspoken truth. The secret still slept. And it would remain so as long as they lived. Thomas had tried to return to his routine, but the work felt different now. Each book he handled seemed a reminder of the ciphered Bible that had started it all, and of how knowledge, once uncovered, demanded a choice. One rainy evening, as he was locking up, a stranger appeared at the library door. She was young, dressed in the practical clothes of a traveller, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. In her hands she held a wrapped bundle. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said. "He told me to find a Thomas Alden if certain stories were true." The cloth fell away to reveal a book, worn, heavy, its leather cover cracked with age. Thomas's breath caught. In the dim light, he saw the faint, deliberate marks in the margins. He looked into the young woman's eyes and saw the same glint of curiosity, of stubborn resolve that had driven him down into the vault. In that moment, he understood. Secrets had a way of finding their next guardian. He took the book gently, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palms. "Some stories," he said quietly, "not meant for everyone, but the right person, they can carry them." She nodded, and without another word turned to leave, disappearing into the curtain of rain. Weeks later, Thomas visited Gregory one last time. They walked the cliffs in silence, the monastery ruins distant and half lost in mist. "We've kept it safe," Gregory said, his voice calm. "But we've also passed the burden on, haven't we?" Thomas gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's the way it's meant to be, not hidden forever, just waiting until the world is ready." They stood there for a long while, watching the tide gnaw at the rocks, the endless cycle of erosion and renewal. The vault was sealed, the relics concealed, but the truth, like the sea, was patient. Moral, even the most dangerous truths are not always meant to be destroyed. Some must be protected, passed from hand to hand, until the time comes when the world can face them. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.